You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K State grain economist Daniel O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K State, Guy Allen. Daniel, Guy, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Last week, our USDA WASDE report came out, and so wanting to give an update now from what we've seen from that report and the markets. And starting off with corn domestically, Daniel, what have we seen?
I'd contend that both domestically and probably on the international side too, that Guy will talk about that the story on corn was the biggest one, followed of course by what we'd seen on the soybean supply demand balance sheet too. So domestically, that the surprise in this report was that the USDA, it wasn't a surprise, pardon me, that they lowered the yield some. People were expecting that from 188.8 in the August report down to 186.7 bushels per acre. Not a surprise, but what really was a surprise was the increase in corn production acres from 97,254,000 in earlier in the August estimate, now up to 98.7 million acres harvested, went from 88.7 to 90 some, and so an increase of about 1.5, just under 1.5 million acres planted, 1.35 harvested. And on a side note, I went back and checked out what the FSA Farm Service Agency reported acreages were, and they jumped to some degree. Not quite as much as that. So, but when you look at historically, the Farm Service Agency, the World Ag Board, that comes up with the WASDE numbers, they look at historic relationships between what the FSA acres are, reported acres are, and where we finally end up at. So they made that call. So by the time the yields had come down and but the acres had gone up, we ended up actually with more corn production forecast. Went from 16.74 billion bushels, pardon me, up to 16.8. So pretty strong increase, up about 72 million. And that combined with a increase in old crop stocks, about 20 million from the previous marketing year, ended up with a total of just about the same figures on ending stocks, basically 2.11 billion bushels of ending stocks projected. Exports had been forecast higher, up to 2.975 billion bushels, and Guy can speak to this in terms of what's happening internationally, but that 2.975 is strong record. And I don't doubt that right now we're set up, if we get these type of supply figures, to have pretty cheap, very affordable prices, and the possibility of the U.S. dollar being supportive of exports. So that to me is the number that we'll be watching, Shelby, for the next several months of this market year, to see if we actually meet the pace of just under 3 billion bushels. We had a record year this last year, and as we were looking at the numbers, we had about 2.75 or thereabouts. But now we're looking at fully almost 200 million bushels more than that. So I'll be watching that. They left the price unchanged at $3.90 per bushel. That's for the marketing year. When looking at the futures, are what they're projecting right now domestically, they're actually, depending on what basis you put on things nationally, we're at about 420 to 440, something like that. So interesting. The USDA, no doubt, they're being judicious, being cautious. The $3.90 figure matches up their numbers. It's interesting to see what the futures have done. And the day of the report, the futures for corn, D's corn, closed up 10 and a quarter cents to $4.30, which was kind of counterintuitive. We weren't expecting with this, basically pretty much a neutral to bearish report, that we'd see the prices go up, but we did close at 430 that day, and since that time have been sort of up and down, but basically went to 430, and now we're just arguing up and down with regard to that. So, Guy, that's the domestic side. What did you see on the international side?
Yeah, I was sort of happy to see that new record for exports just squeaked across the line here, which was good. In an international situation, the world production was dropped 2 million metric tons from August down to 1.287 billion metric tons. Ending stocks declined by a similar amount, 1.1 million metric tons to 281. That's still leaving us comfortable, but of all the commodities, corn's probably the tightest on that. On the Brazilian production, they added 3 million metric tons to Brazilian corn, putting it at 135 million metric tons. And this is the largest export that Brazil is going to have on corn there as well. But they're also increasing their feed and their ethanol usage domestically there in Brazil, which is a lot of that increase is being picked up by growing domestic consumption on that. Uh, Interesting thing, if we're talking about imports, China, they cut their corn imports by 1 million metric tons down to 3. Not too surprising there. I think China's days of being a big corn importer are waning, particularly as they're seeing increased domestic production there in China. And most of that China's growth in domestic production is they're starting to pick up some of this GMO advantage that we've seen in our production over the last 15, 20 years. EU corn was slashed 4.7 million tons to 58, although they did increase their exports a million metric tons to 23. Argentina and Brazil going forward, no changes in their numbers, 37 and 43 respectively. Russia was dropped a bit. A lot of interesting things going on in Russia, but it's just hard to get good information out of there. And it's got to be a bit of a growing concern economically in that whole Russia situation. Just one comment on the demand side. One thing we are seeing is increases in wheat feeding. I think outside the U.S., USDA increased wheat feeding 3.25 million metric tons to just under 80 million metric tons of wheat. So wheat, we'll talk about that later, but it's still pretty cheap and pricing itself into the feed ration in places.
And moving on to grain sorghum, Daniel, what are we seeing domestically for that crop?
Um, we did see an increase in yields slightly, about 1.4 bushels per acre for the U.S. estimate. Uh, uh, that went along also with about a 40 million, pardon me, a 40,000 acre increase in grain sorghum planted acres, and that's that same increase in harvested. So went from about 391 million bushels up to 402. And really, stand back and look at sorghum. The big issue for sorghum in this coming year has to do with the export figure. We ended up, after a lot of optimism early in this last market year, the one that ended August 31st, ended up with 95 million bushels of U.S. grain sorghum exports. Are projecting for the next one 225. So clearly, to do that, we're anticipating that will come to some type of a trade agreement with China, because they're the predominant world importer of grain sorghum, and that will get back on track to meet pretty strong levels. But absent that, then I think we're kind of paralyzed by the slow pace of sorghum exports. We will use up grain sorghum eventually at a low price. It's going to be at a price locally where it'll pay to use it and very very competitively with corn. But in the country, and Guy, you've probably seen this too. I think this happens overseas. If we have grain sorghum because of the slow export pace that we didn't use up from last year, now we're going to have another strong crop coming, and that's a real issue with regard to where sorghum's going. And Guy, I know both you and I have been looking at those markets and potential solutions. Do you have any comments on
Yeah.
the sorghum side?
Well, the big challenge for sorghum is if you're going to get an end user, whether it's a feedlot or an ethanol plant or a poultry producer to switch over to sorghum, he's got to be able to stand out there and he wants to buy a sufficient amount of quantity to justify changing that ration, just not bits and pieces. And at the moment, with lower prices and without really a lot of harvest pressure yet. We just haven't seen the volume coming there, and the price discovery has been a bit difficult over the last few months, particularly. So I think they'll switch, but it's going to have to get, I think, to a bit more of a discount with, and the end users are going to want to buy volume sufficiently to justify his changes on that.
And that'll probably happen around harvest or shortly thereafter when you got the quantities right there.
Yeah, one comment I would like to make is on the carries with the big, record crop of corn and big crop of beans. Space is going to be tight all over, particularly in the western corn belt. Board spreads had sort of narrowed in a bit, but after the USDA report, they widened out a bit more. We're well over 50, closer to 60% of full financial carry. We're going to see everybody from the farmer to the country elevator, and I think even the end users will buy some fairly cheap grain. But that's keeping the basis values fairly cheap, particularly in the Western Corn Belt where space is exceptionally tight. Uh, so the key thing on carries is the carries are there, and you'll get paid for carrying it, but you've got to lock in the carry. You got to lock in that forward price, and don't be afraid to try to negotiate that a bit.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by K State's Daniel O'Brien and Guy Allen.